thank you all so much for your time today and for joining. Hopefully, we'll be able to have a good discussion and dig into some of these important topics. So why don't we start? So what we're going to be talking about today is racial identity development and how that relates to the development of cultural competency in the behavioral health field. So I would love to hear from people in the chat just briefly, how they're doing right now, what they're thinking, sort of in, one or two words, what you're kind of bringing to the meeting or how you're showing up here today, if you don't mind. I know I would say I am excited to talk about this topic. It's a topic that I care deeply about and enjoy speaking about. And every time I talk to people, I learn something new from them. So I'm feeling pretty energized for a Wednesday afternoon. You guys probably can't quite say the same thing. But yeah, if you want to drop it in the chat, how you are right now, that'd be great. Oh, thank you, Alethea. Alethea's intrigued. All right. So I'll go ahead and kick us off. I kind of have it divided into 3 different sections that will hopefully kind of guide the discussion. The general plan will be to pause after each section and pause for some discussion there, and we'll kind of break it into those 3 pieces with more discussion at the end. All right. So, obviously we got to start with the definitions. So I wanted to talk just very briefly about what is racial identity. And I do need to say up front that I'm not an expert in racial identity or really even in racial identity development. There's so much amazing research out there. And I've learned a little bit of it as I've sort of started to understand my own identity and done a lot of training of behavioral health clinicians. But I'm by no means an expert, in racial identity development, but I definitely have the basics that I want to share with you all today. So hopefully you've been attending more of these trainings and have heard this a lot of times. So although there isn't that biological or scientific basis, race is very real as a social construct. It operates in very real ways. It can be seen scientifically, definitively in our lives and how things play out, really conferring those benefits to some, withholding benefits from others. And so it is very real, and it is this kind of social construct that that has physical features as well as non-physical features that essentially people use to classify people and then make judgments about superiority and inferiority. David, I'm trying my best to answer your question. It's externally and internally constructed. So it's about how you think about how others perceive you, as well as how you perceive yourself. And a lot of the research on racial identity in general is more focused on youth of color, people of color, specifically around the development of Black Americans. And what they find is that a positive and strong racial identity is really a resiliency factor. It's something that's important to develop, something that can confer benefits when trying to essentially navigate a world or a country with racism in a racialized society. So really having that strong sense of identity and connection as part of a racial group can help buffer against impacts of racism. And in a race-conscious society, that concept of race isn't going to be based on superiority or inferiority, right? We think that it's important for everybody to have a sense of their identity, including white people, right? So if we're trying to move towards, being a race-conscious society, just wanted to, to note that the meaning will ultimately not include these notions about superiority and inferiority. So what we know is that like a lot of psychological constructs and behavioral constructs, there is a developmental trajectory. So this is not kind of what should happen, or you know, someone's idea about what might be nice. This is developmental research. So this is what has been learned about folks over time and how their development unfolds. And you know, essentially these predictable patterns that are defined in stages have been identified. Now, you know, I'll say this a lot of different times. The racial development trajectories are not linear. You don't kind of finish one step, go to the next one, finish that one, go to the next one. There's definitely setbacks and changes along the way. There might be moments or, you know, phases in someone's life where they do a lot of development, and then they may not develop further for a while. They may go backwards. You know, the phases are helpful for understanding it, but it probably makes the most sense to think about yourself and others as having a current dominant phase, but you're not really only going to be in that phase. And you know, each stage, we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the stages, but you know, in a very broad sense, a stage is, you know, it's going to have certain beliefs, certain feelings, certain behaviors that have to do with how someone understands themselves, you know, as a racial being. So the first model that was developed was a model of Black identity development. And this was originally developed in the 70s. It was studying a group of individuals that were integrating into a predominantly white college institution. Those were the very original research studies came from. It's been updated and looked at across the years with some of the other seminal work happening in the early 90s. So I'm going to spend a little bit so this really is kind of where a lot of it started. A lot of what I'm bringing to you today has a focus or a bend towards white identity development, because, you know, that's the area that I've learned more about, and where I think I have more to share. But want to cover, you know, as many of the models as possible, and just wanted to kind of give that disclaimer. That's sort of why we're going to be focusing on that a little bit, even though hopefully it'll be relevant for everybody. So just want to go through the cross model, because that was like the first one. Everything kind of had been built off this. So the idea is that in stage one, or what's noticed first in early childhood development, is that by being surrounded by a dominant culture and absorbing information about minority groups, essentially Black youth develop pro-white attitudes, and essentially that the use of the white society as a barometer for success. So essentially internalizing those societal messages early in life. Stage two is called encounter, which does typically involve a specific event. Most people, and you might want to spend a moment thinking about it, most people can think back to a time where they sort of first realize their race, and again, this is the specific model for Black identity development. So really kind of that first experiences of racism that really have that personal significance. Usually, I think the best estimates are this usually happens around age 7. Obviously, that's going to vary a lot depending on context. People usually describe it as feeling confused, really kind of unsettled internally, and you know, essentially kind of being faced with needing to acknowledge this, and so it can be, you know, it can have some stress associated with it. Stage 3 is called immersion, which essentially is described as a phase where someone is really drawn to be fully immersed in the Black experience and culture, very strong pro-Black worldview. And this phase, when defined specifically in phase 3, it can often include anti-white sentiments, kind of a rejection of white values, a rejection of white norms, and, you know, distrust there. So you'll see some of the some things continue through phases and some don't. And so immersion is you know, sometimes people will experience this in their teenage years. And I do think it's important to note that this is a phase where you will hear people sometimes will essentially buy into stereotypes about their own groups. So sort of, you know, kind of be led into thinking that stereotypes relate to their cultural group, and kind of adopting those sometimes in immersion. Stage 4 is internalizations. As you can see, you know, really getting to that point where it is part of who you are. It is now kind of inside your identity. And you know, your view of yourself really starts to develop more fully, and not just your race, but essentially how your race intersects with other identities. So there's a sense of pride and achievement with being Black. Being Black is seen as positive, valued, something important. But I'm sorry, I have some repetitive bullet points. But also sort of not the only aspect of your identity. So this intersectional issues, you know, a lot of that research is really getting at some of this internalization, and some folks that might be in immersion might be less likely to see some of those intersections, whereas then once folks are internalized, they can kind of see, you know, they have this really positive sense of self, and it's valued as part of who they are, but it also is connected to other aspects of your identity. And last is stage 5. They call that internalization commitment. So for Black Americans, this is usually, you know, really not far after adolescence, very early adulthood. When I was teaching in a college setting, folks were sort of achieving this. You know, a lot of folks are actually coming to college already achieving this this stage. And essentially, this is where, you know, that internal identity that was formed, it's still there, but there's also that commitment to working against social oppression, and that personal commitment to impacting change. You know, so really, kind of, it's, you know, it takes those immersive experiences out in the world. Then you're internalizing your identity, and then you're committing to those actions again in the external world as the last stage. And I think it's really important, again, to go back to the fact that it's not linear. When things happen, so for example, you might have read in the news last year, you know, when there's a lot of additional media attention and there were some high-profile police killings, folks feel themselves going back to other stages, right? Someone might, you know, really feel a desire to pull away from white norms and things like that in those situations, and that is completely normal. It's not like a regression or something like that. It's completely normal. You know, people, you do move throughout the stages, but the idea is that you would ultimately hope for, really hope for everyone that they would achieve all 5 stages. All right, so kind of if that's the picture for Black Americans or people of color more broadly, you know, really kind of seeing these things for what they are, ultimately, you know, working to develop this positive identity, and then kind of being ready to commit to these external actions, and seeing racism for what it is, you know, structural racism, systemic racism, interpersonal racism, microaggressions, you know, all of that. That really is kind of that reality and that context. But when it comes to folks that are white, oftentimes they'll say things like this. They'll say, well, I'm just normal. People just see me as normal. I see myself as normal. And, you know, why are we making everything about race, right? I don't have that feeling, right? Because if whiteness has been normalized, and that's the dominant group that everything is sort of essentially compared to, it leaves a lot of white people with actually lacking that sense of a racial identity, because whiteness has been normalized in that way. Again, going back to those definitions with of inferiority and superiority, and how that's played out historically. And so, you know, essentially, a lot of that, what that can look like, is really ignorance about race. And you know, I think the timeline of this is really important to note also, especially for folks that might have been raised in more of a white enclave, live somewhere where they didn't really have that much interaction with people of color. The development of the racial identity might lag quite a bit. And, you know, the timing that people are going through the phases are probably going to look different depending on the context that you grew up in. So, you know, it can lead to a lot of difficult conversations. Again, one example relevant from my life is working at predominantly white institutions with folks in the 18 to 22 year range, where white individuals might be very early in their development of an identity, and folks from other backgrounds might be, you know, stage 4 or 5, really further along. So I want to spend a little bit more time going over the phases of white identity development, again, because we're going to be tying that into cultural competence. So the model the prominent model really is the Helms Model, and it's from 1990. You'll see some similarities between this and the Cross Model. So the first stage is called contact. And essentially the main piece, the main way that you want to think about this stage is the idea of a colorblind attitude. So you can notice race. No one says like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, you know, specifically talking about phenotypic features and skin color. They can notice race, but yeah, they don't really find the difference salient. So you know, very essentially, you know, experiencing all of those social messages and unconscious biases, but really not being aware of it, not being aware of own biases. And oftentimes in this phase, people will actually think that racism is propagated because people are discussing and acknowledging it. So the idea that, you know, talking about it is kind of causing the problem. That's really, that's kind of stage 1, you know, which, you know, is in a way a type of oblivion, or not really knowing what's going on. Stage 2 is called disintegration. And this, similar to the Cross Model in stage 2, there's usually some personal significance here. It could be an event. You know, when people begin interacting more with people of color, or learn new information about racism, for example, you know, start to further their education, you know, essentially your worldview will be confronted with the knowledge and examples of racism and racial privilege, right? So, you know, thinking about, you know, if someone maybe even grew up in a really white context and then came to college, maybe doing student teaching and, you know, essentially noticing those things like, the teacher never lets the Black kids go to the bathroom when they ask, but they always let the white kids, right? Or, you know, so we say that you know, whites and Blacks use drugs at the same rate, but the incarceration for Blacks is much higher. So essentially just this, you know, information about reality where you're really confronted with, you know, the gaps in the colorblind worldview. And a lot of times it can feel really, it's a very difficult stage to navigate, very uncomfortable, because it's a state of conflict. It's, how can I think that race doesn't matter and also this be true? There's, as you'll see in the next stage, there's really 2 ways you can go with that. If you want to hold this information together, there's really, you know, only 2 ways that you can go. And disintegration is, again, it's a very uncomfortable stage because it's a sense of unrest and, you know, really trying to make sense of it and kind of grapple with things that you're hearing and seeing. And so, you know, usually what happens next is what's called stage 3, reintegration. And essentially kind of, there's a little bit of a general understanding that, yeah, you know, white people are probably responsible for racism, but really that guilt and shame usually tends to turn towards anger at this phase, and it's sort of a blame the victim stance. So what I was saying before about you have conflictual information and you're trying to hold it in your mind. The most common way to go, and what people tend to do as a stage 3, and then they go on to stage 4, is essentially assume things that will make the information work. So essentially that student teacher would tell herself, oh, well, I'm sure that she's probably had a lot of Black students, and they're from this neighborhood around here, and they probably don't know how to act when they go to the bathroom, so it's probably not a racial difference, it's something else. And during this time, there's evidence that people really are paying selective attention to stereotype confirming information. So really that hostility is there. You're kind of like trying to make sense of things, but there can be a lot of anger, and just a lot of resistance. So a little more comfortable than disintegration, but also not a comfortable stage to be in either, because it is, some people will talk about some white rage being apparent at stage 3, because you really don't, that white rage, that's, you would think stage 1 is, where things would, potentially be the worst externally, but you really don't see that at stage 1. All right, so stage 4 is kind of the first stage of defining, assuming we're trying to have a non-racist white identity, not based on superiority or inferiority. The first 3 are more external focused, and then the last 3 start to take it more internally. And so pseudo-independence, it's the intellectual understanding is there, the kind of acceptance of kind of reality, history, learning about racism, thinking about it. That's all very real, and starting to essentially be integrated into what does it mean to be white. But there aren't really as many feelings. It's a little bit more abstract. Kind of, definitely can see racism and identify it, but they might still harbor some beliefs that, yeah, it is real, it really happened, I'm not denying it, really bad, but probably if people of color worked harder, maybe it wouldn't affect them, really harboring some kind of beliefs behind the scenes, very intellectualization. But again, the first step in developing that identity. All right, stage 5. This is the white identity developed version of immersion. We saw a lot of this last summer. Essentially this is where the feelings come along. So it's not just an intellectual understanding of racism, and this idea of, yeah, we need to figure that out, it's bad, to actually, trying to change yourself. And so a lot of times white savior, or concepts such as the white savior are seen a lot at level 4, right? The idea is, I do understand racism, and I do want to help, I'm committed to help, but it's sort of an idea that, maybe white people should solve racism by trying to change what people of color do, right? So stage 5 goes beyond that, and essentially you're actively trying to redefine it, trying to look at yourself, very critical of yourself, very, these people that are in stage 5 are very vocal, bless them. I love to revisit stage 5 like at least once a year, very much just sort of really wanting to reject white norms, being really critical of yourself, really critical of other whites, really proud of your anti-racist stance, really, really verbal, vocal, kind of out there with it. And during this stage, you do need support from other anti-racist whites who are asking those same questions, because it is associated with a lot of internal reflection. And stage 6 is essentially autonomy. So at this point, you are able to internalize a positive white racial identity, which, not in the sense of a white pride, again, not in a superiority, inferiority manner, but in the idea of, this is my reality, and I have the ability to act in an anti-racist way. So you can have influence within your sphere of influence. Again, maybe less about kind of a little bit, sometimes I'll say this is a little more about walking the walk, whereas stage 5 is a little more about talking the talk, maybe, like you're really just kind of on fire for social justice. Whereas in stage 6, it's, you know, probably more about kind of taking some of those actions, being willing to use your privilege, and really valuing true diversity and difference, not just thinking about skin color, but actually, you know, being interested in cultural differences and being open to that. And also seeking and accepting feedback from colleagues and friends of color. So again, assuming that, yes, it is white people's responsibility to address racism, but it's by addressing things in the systems themselves or within white folks. It's not about trying to change the behavior of people of color. So that's really stage 6, where you're trying to go, and what it would look like to have an anti-racist white identity developed. Again, just really want to you know, say this one more time. It's not static. It's not linear. When events happen, there can be a big drive, you know, again, for people to maybe go into an immersive experience, as well as, unfortunately, go into sort of a reintegration type experience, right? When you're, you know, really trying to hold multiple pieces of information in your mind at once. You know, dominant culture would have you reintegrate into that more superiority, inferiority worldview, and really not move forward into pseudo independence. There's just the line one more time. And again, you know, it's really interesting watching this last summer, seeing some 50, 60-year-old folks going through immersion for the first time. You know, I would be curious if anyone kind of noticed that in their surroundings, you know, really this idea that, you know, we've been a little better about probably calling out colorblind attitudes, calling out those reintegrated racist beliefs. But it seemed that, you know, last summer really taught me that there were a lot of folks that were actually really operating from a pseudo-independence worldview, and probably still harboring some of that, you know, kind of white savior, oh, let me try to fix this type beliefs. And then last summer, with the murder of George Floyd and other events, they really kind of were having those immersive experiences for the first time, which, you know, now the question is, so after that, you know, how many folks have gone on to autonomy versus how many have shifted back to pseudo-independence, or even reintegration. All right, so that was kind of part 1. So I'll pause there and see if we want to have any discussion, and then we'll start talking about, you know, cultural competence and trying to pull these things together. Anyone have anything they want to share, or are folks able to see, you know, regardless of your background, see yourself in any of these stages, or think about things from your timeline that have lined up from these stages? Yes, feel free to unmute if you want to share. And yes, Mary, I'll be sharing the PowerPoint. And you don't have to share verbally. You can also either in the chat or just take a moment to really kind of think about it. Again, it's not you know, cut and dry stages, but hopefully you can look back and remember some of those salient events, and think about kind of how they've shaped your trajectory, and, you know, maybe where you're operating from now. And it's, you know, it's not to say that everyone is going to have, all white people are going to have that extreme immersive experience. Same for Black people and people from other backgrounds. The immersion phase, it can be short, it can be long, but it does tend to happen. And so, you know, when I worked with people in this more in a therapeutic context, you know, if they haven't had that experience, even if it was, right, only only a week or two, you know, the likelihood is that they're really actually in reintegration, and they haven't yet, you know, kind of gotten to that, you know, really grappling with pseudo-independence, and really kind of moving forward. Anyone want to share anything before we go into cultural competence for the next little bit?
Yes, I want to make a general comment, a little experience that I had when I had young children. You know, we were told by the school district, listen, you kids, you really only speak in English because, you know, they spoke Spanish as well. And we found that surprising that they would tell us that, simply because, just like you said, you know, the English is so dominant, my kids are going to learn it anyways. So, you know, I was surprised that they would tell them, listen, maybe your kids should only speak English and not both. But, you know, what we did is we continued speaking Spanish at home. But again, like you said, you know, this culture is so dominant that they had no problems going back and forth and adjusting to the language.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's a great example of how, you know, people in administrative roles that are operating at these levels of development, you know, that you could not even see that, right? That being bilingual would be such a strength and so impressive, and instead kind of seeing it more through that racial lens of this, you know, this is white culture, this is what we do, and not really even challenging themselves before they say that. So yeah, that's thanks for sharing that example. All right, well, I will move right ahead, starting to hopefully pull some of these things together. David saying, never heard the stages, grown up in ethnically diverse area. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, typically if you grow up in a more diverse area, it tends to happen on the earlier side. And so, you know, and again, I think, well, we'll get into kind of future directions later, but yet it tends to happen more on an early side, as opposed to when folks maybe, you know, a common example in America, just based on where people live and how they congregate, is folks will be in a white enclave until college years, and then white people will go to college and, you know, essentially kind of start those phases there. And you can, there will be both social support for reintegrating, and, you know, essentially, you know, forming further enclaves. And then there's also going to be hopefully support, and growing support for, you know, developing that identity and moving on into pseudo-independence, immersion. You definitely see a lot of immersion in college. You know, these people are on fire for racial justice. Again, it's not that you just always want to be in autonomy. You know, it's not that it's wrong to be in a different stage. It's just kind of, that's how the development tends to go, and you do see that in those early adulthood years. All right. So just kind of starting in a really general sense, you know, I think probably most people would agree that cultural competency is pretty much now accepted as a core component in behavioral health training. The idea that you know, we live in a multicultural nation, and you need to be able to work with folks from all types of backgrounds. You need to have those skills and that knowledge. You don't want to do harm. You know, it's been integrated into most graduate training programs in behavioral health, as well as some continuing education. It's not universally required for continuing education, but I think some states have moved in that direction. So most people think about cultural competence as three things. The first one being knowledge. Again, just being informed, knowing about history, knowing about different cultures, so that you know, you know what someone, if someone says they're celebrating a certain holiday, you know what that means in terms of what they might be observing, things like that. The next one, oops, sorry. The next one being skills. So having, because when you're being trained as a behavioral health professional, you're getting trained in, it's a skill-based field. So empathy, active listening, assessment, screening, cognitive interventions, behavioral interventions, the whole works. You really have to have skills when it comes to cultural competency and really integrate what you learn about cultural competency in these areas, integrate that into your broader behavioral health skills so that you can function in a competent manner. And then the last one being awareness, which really, I didn't choose the order. Awareness is usually actually, thought to come first, that if you don't have that awareness of yourself and your background and power dynamics, which, power dynamics is something that we all study when we study behavioral health, typically really thinking about dynamics between the therapist and the client. So we're used to talking about power, thinking about power and control, and selecting therapeutic approaches based on, how we want to treat power and empower folks or be an expert. So when it comes to cultural competency, it's essentially same thing, kind of integrating that awareness about yourself, how you present, and what it's like in the therapy room. And what is being more, sometimes it'll be kind of said as a separate construct, but really I would say more the updated version of this is really more about cultural humility. So yes, we should all develop our awareness, we should all develop our knowledge, we should all work on our skills, but ultimately it's a broader stance that's referred to as cultural humility that is really what gets us by in these multiracial interactions, and really knowing that if you don't know something, asking in a respectful way, and really bringing more of that humility to interactions, specifically those around race. So, of course, probably so if we kind of are saying, yeah, it's important for behavioral health, we know that, but can you develop it, right? Should we be selecting people because they have it? Or is this something that you can grow, right? Where does this come from? And in general, I think that the evidence would say that the answer is yes, to a certain extent. There's evidence that courses can be helpful, workshops can be helpful, and also that doing research yourself, kind of going through that discovery process yourself on research related to, either different cultures or inequities or cultural competence, that can improve your cultural competence as a clinician. But also it can be a lot broader than that. You gain it from your formal training, but also from informal experiences, right? So as you're developing your identity as a helper, there's a lot of informal experiences that you'll gather, and that you're kind of forming all these different parts of your identity. So it's not just the formal trainings, but also those informal experiences and interacting with folks from diverse backgrounds. All right, so I want to kind of pull those two concepts together, because that's kind of getting at the heart of what I'm hoping to communicate today, and what I'm hoping that maybe something will jump out at you or stick with you. So, we talked a little bit about colorblind attitudes in early stages of development. And, this is something that can be and has been, looked at more broadly. So before people ask the question of, does your own white racial identity development matter as far as your ability to develop cultural competence? Before people asked that, they were really sort of asking related questions about colorblind attitudes. So essentially, can colorblind attitudes bring harm into the therapy room? So a lot of this is what we already talked about with the contact stage. The ideas, some of it's very unconscious, like essentially choosing white values and describing those as the essential characteristics for promotion and advancement, even when they have nothing to do with the job. being unaware of pretty blatant issues, you know, might deny that microaggressions even exist, let alone not be able to notice them yourself, and really just be unaware of systemic racism and structural racism and things like that. And there is evidence that this is harmful at the client therapist level. There's been probably between 10 and 20 different studies on this. Just some examples: decreased empathy for Black clients in vignettes, and of course these are in experimental conditions where folks get the, you know, same conditions flip-flopped with different races and things, as well as placing responsibility for symptoms on Black clients, but not for white clients in the same vignette. So essentially, you know, blaming someone for their own behavioral health disorder and symptoms, you know, in a race-based pattern. So there really is this, the idea that all the way down on the continuum, colorblind attitudes can be really harmful and should, or I would argue, should be screened for when it comes to putting people in helping positions where they're expected to interact with multiracial folks. Also, it perpetuates macro system issues, right? So you don't have to be, you know, high up in administration. Even just being someone's clinical supervisor or something like that, you know, when people behave in this way, it perpetuates the system overall, and that's, behavioral health is not immune to that. And then, as you would guess, there is some basic research, just in case you weren't sure, that when folks have colorblind attitudes, their multicultural competence is rated as lower, both by themselves and someone observing them and them responding to vignettes. And so where, to me, it kind of really gets interesting is thinking about that training, right? So if the idea is you can learn multicultural competence, there are formal ways to teach it, but we know that your informal context and your personal development matters too. How do we kind of pull all that together? And there is, I think, 2 studies on this, so it's certainly not well understood, but there is some evidence that holding colorblind attitudes can be an impediment to multicultural training helping. So essentially, the positive benefits that are shown from multicultural training, in a way, the people that need them the most might not get them, because it seems that it potentially, you know, there's an interaction effect there. But, you know, we want to go beyond colorblind attitudes, right? We want to really think about this, you know, more on the continuum. I hope it's, or I bet it's pretty obvious that that colorblind attitudes during the contact stage, and then that hostility, blaming the victim during the reintegration stage, that those would be harmful in a cross-racial therapeutic relationship. In any direction, whether it's a white client working with a Black clinician, or a white clinician working with Black client, or folks from other backgrounds. So, you know, the question is really, well, does it matter beyond that? You know, so assuming that in, you know, this day and age, we can expect people to reach people that are going into behavioral health, college educated, to reach pseudo-independence. Does it matter beyond that, right? Or is that kind of good enough? That's a question that I know for me is extremely interesting, because again, when you're hiring people for jobs, when you're setting up professional development opportunities, you know, there's a big difference there, and a lot of it is sort of that internal personal work. So it would be important to know that it really does make a difference. So there might be one other study on this, but this is the one I'm going to talk about, from 2015, a study that went into this. They had about 500, all 487 of them were white. They were doctoral level students, so clinical, counseling, or school psychology, and they were at least in their first year of practicum. And so this is essentially what they found. They looked at knowledge, skills, and awareness, the 3 different parts of cultural competency. And the first thing they looked at was just the basics, social desirability, right? So, you know, does this person tend to, you know, say what they think people want them to say? Age and trainings. These three came out as when they were looking at just kind of general demographic variables and background. These were all significant predictors of self-reported cultural awareness. Next, they looked at colorblind attitudes. I would have had that come up by itself because they actually did it in 3 steps. Next, they added in colorblind attitudes, and that also had a significant impact. I think there's a nuance there. Let me see if I can find my notes. There was a nuance there to that finding, if I can think of it. Let's see. There we go. Okay, yeah. So, so when it came to the colorblind attitudes, it wasn't all colorblind attitudes. It was the blatant unawareness. So, sort of the unawareness of racial issues was what was driving the relation between a colorblind attitude and low cultural competence in the awareness area. And then from there, they added in this concept of linear identity development. So essentially went phase by phase and added each phase to the model to see if it predicted in a negative way or a positive way, right? If you were dominant in that phase. And essentially, you know, so as you would expect on the early end of the spectrum, there was a negative effect for contact and disintegration. There was no effect for reintegration or pseudo-independence. And then there was a positive impact for immersion, emersion, or autonomy. So, you know, pretty much following that linear pattern, but interestingly not having a connection one way or the other at those middle stages. So next, looking at knowledge, and it's the same model. And I think that so with this one, the colorblind attitudes, I remember they were definitely still significant, but when it came to the linear identity development, yeah, the interesting piece here that I wanted to share is that it was actually immersion that had the strongest positive effect on knowledge, more so than autonomy. So I thought that was really interesting because, you know, so if we are going to agree that knowledge is a core piece of cultural competence and that people gain it most when they're having these more immersive emotional experiences, and then, you know, even if ultimately people do move on to autonomy, you know, in a way it sounds like that the knowledge piece might not continue developing in that way. So I want to think about, you know, how do we make sure that folks have access to cultural competence development, you know, at all stages of development. And lastly, they looked at skills. So this one was really interesting as well. Found the same 3 were the background variables. Colorblind attitudes did matter, predicting skills, but the linear piece was a little bit different. So what it was at reintegration, pseudo-independence, and autonomy, there was a relation in the expected directions, negative and positive. But at immersion, there wasn't that relation. So essentially what that means is that some folks in immersion might have better knowledge for cultural competence, but when it comes to the skills, they're actually higher on both sides of it, autonomy or pseudo-independence, when it comes to you know, actually interacting and working with people from diverse backgrounds. You know, and what people think this means is that when you're really deep in that immersion phase, and there's that kind of like self-criticism, sometimes it's like there's like a discomfort being around people from other backgrounds because of this like white guilt type feelings and things like that. So I thought that was really interesting that even though, you know, the idea is that, so at autonomy, there was a strong relationship to your skills, but to go from pseudo-independence to autonomy, you know, there is that pathway through immersion, and skills were lower during that phase. All right, so I'll stop there again. The last part is a little more action-oriented kind of things that how you might, you know, take this, or things that I do to take this and pull it into my life. So as far as the concepts and how they connect to one another, would love to hear some feedback from you all, whether this resonates with any of your behavioral health training, if you came from the field, or from your work that you do at DBHDS, if you didn't come from the behavioral health field. I'm also curious, you know, what do you all think that this might mean kind of for training implications? You know, it is pretty widely accepted that cultural competence should be part of training, but when it comes to really the importance of understanding your own identity and things like that, how important do you all think that is when it comes to training in the behavioral health field?
This is Rafael Hernandez again. Just to make another just general comment, I do like the idea that we're looking to put things more in other languages because it gives people more access. And there's a level of comfort, even for myself, you know, clearly English is my second language, but having things in Spanish as an example, in my case, I think it's helpful. I think it encourages people to seek help, especially, yeah, I've worked in the mental health background for many years, and I think that is super important in my opinion. And I'm glad to see that the department, you know, is going in that direction.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's kind of where we're going to go to, you know, in terms of, well, you know, what does this mean? And that's a perfect example at the administrative level of if you kind of had that more colorblind attitude, you probably wouldn't even be thinking about language access. And then if you were in more of a reintegration phase, you might actually see people that actually kind of get angry when people request language access, you know, and that, you know, some more of that like hostility. So you could definitely see it play out in terms of priorities and what gets funded and things like that. That's a perfect example.
Lisa, this is Jamie. I was just going to say, I think it's, you know, highly important that cultural competence is included in training. You know, I've been out of school for a really long time, right? And it just wasn't one of those things that was infused consistently. You know, there was discussion about working with different cultures, but it just wasn't highlighted and there wasn't continued work on it, unfortunately. And so I'm just glad that it's really at the forefront and really being worked on now.
Hi, Lisa, this is Pam. And I was looking at the comment that Bernadette put in the chat. And I was kind of thinking along the same lines. I think I'm just curious, like, you know, based on your stage and where you are, which I'm even having a hard time trying to figure out where I am. And I know you said they're not linear, so I'm normal. But would you then target training to the different stages? I mean, that's what she's basically saying, that she thinks that would be helpful to do that.
Yeah, sorry, I hadn't caught that comment. Thanks for pointing that out. Yes, Bernadette and Pam, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and it, you know, don't necessarily, there's only a couple of those studies of those really detailed ones we were just talking about, you know, but the idea of there might be some level, you know, it's a process and it's people's personal identity and we're not trying to, you know, keep people from the field, but there might be kind of some basic level of achievement that you might want to kind of screen for, so that people can then, right, absorb those messages and get that information. And so, yeah, like almost kind of helping people do some of that early development as part of the training curriculum. Because when you think about it, you know, I wouldn't have concerns of very many clinicians of color, but thinking about white clinicians, if you graduate college at 22 and then you're in a master's program 22 and 23, you know, that's just, I should have brought those statistics, but in the white population, that's going to be very few people that are that are in those higher stages of development, even just getting to pseudo independence. You see a lot of reintegration and things like that around that age. So yeah, I love that idea of knowing who you're working with, knowing your audience, and knowing kind of what message they need next to move forward.
And I'll be transparent in saying that, I mean, I kind of followed that trajectory you're talking about. I mean, I didn't get exposed to other cultures until I went to college, you know, so that's where it started. And I mean, it's been continual. I mean, I've been able to be in different cultures since then, so that's helped. But it'd be nice to be, I don't know if there's tools to help you figure out where you are either. I mean, other than your own awareness, which I guess is the best tool, but and then knowing which trainings you should take, you know, to help yourself.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's very well said. And yeah, and you know, and as you you know, that is kind of as people move forward through the stages, you know, you do find that even if you're not in autonomy all the time, but you will find that you're more comfortable talking about race, being open about you know, your experiences, things that you've thought, the ways that you've you know, been privileged and things like that, in a really open and, you know, willing to learn fashion, not just in a you know, that really painful immersion kind of really white guilt type stance that folks will experience at some point. You know, as you move through that, it you know, the commitment has to stay there to be part of autonomy, that commitment to making the change that you can and really, you know, living in reality. But you know, some of those more feelings kind of go away, and just like you said, you know, you're willing to, you know, chat about it in a training. So that's good. I'm gonna read Gail's comment. Yeah, challenging to, yeah, no, it's and there is a scale. It's called the White Racial Attitudes Inventory. I was trying to find it, but I couldn't locate a copy of it directly. And it kind of asks questions, you know, that are associated with all these different phases, and kind of helps you see, you know, where you might be. For some reason I could not place it. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, it also makes me think of like the implicit attitudes tests. And I used to do this some when I would train people, but I learned it from an attorney who she was just like on fire for everything. And I was sitting in on her. She ran a family law clinic, and I was like doing something there, and like it was their first day, and she said, okay, well, go home and take the implicit attitudes test and then print out your results and bring them to me next class. And you know, her stance was, I need to know what type of biases you're working with. I'm going to put you in front of these families that I'm representing and supporting. And so, like, yeah, of course I need to know how biased you are. And her transparency with that really impacted me. And then I didn't quite do it in that way, but I would have folks take the tests and, you know, kind of do more self-reflection, not necessarily not you know, forcing a conversation with me or bringing it back to me, but, you know, asking for that self-reflection.
I think that's really helpful. This is Gail, Lisa. And I think it's interesting, and I think where I was going with this somewhat too is that I think we have spent so many years from a hiring standpoint to teach people not to be biased in their hiring attitudes and equal opportunity and all those kinds of things. And I think for many people, it's a shift to say, I need to acknowledge my bias. I need to make sure that I am working on that. You made a comment about openness to learning. So I think when we're looking at hiring, it's looking at someone who may have some self-awareness and be open to the learning, not regardless of where they are in their stage, but acknowledging whatever stage they may be in. If they can have that openness, then there's an ability to learn and to teach. But this has been really interesting for me because it has been a bit of a shift. I really identified with what Pam was talking about, and Jamie too, being of a certain age in my late 50s.
Yeah, and it was you know, again, it's if that didn't happen, then that wouldn't be reality, right? You know, it involves an acceptance of reality and acceptance of history, of how things are set up and why things have played out the way they have. And you know, if it wasn't real, then, you know, that wouldn't be the experience. But again, it's you can, you know, move past that, you know, shame and fear in a way that's not just pseudo-independence. You mentioned hiring practices. That's such a good example where someone that was in a more pseudo-independent framework of, you know, yeah, I understand racism, you know, they kind of maybe harbor some beliefs behind the scenes, but like, yeah, I know it's important to diversify. I know I shouldn't be biased. They kind of know all that. But if that's where you're operating from, you probably would never really be thinking to be screening white applicants on where, you know, that's where the liability would be, right? That if it would be more likely that a white applicant would have an underdeveloped racial identity than otherwise. But people, again, with that normalization, a lot of hiring managers probably wouldn't even think to notice that.
This is Pam again. It just made me, something popped into my head. Are there questions that you can ask on interviews about that? I mean, I don't know if there's been any studies done on that, but that would be interesting.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never thought about it like that. I do think that I know that it's a habit for me. I do think it is always important to ask something about cultural competence, or you know, with everything going on currently in politics, it's very easy to put that in. You know, like give me an example of a time that you've you know, stood up to a racist policy or something like that. You know, kind of switching it up. I do think that the way people respond to questions like that can give you a sense of maybe where they are or their comfort level. If it is a job that, you know, we're really talking about starting to address these disparities in behavioral health, which means we're going to have to be talking about it and looking at it. And so I do think sometimes people's responses to more general questions like, you know, tell me about a time when you had to take culture into consideration and what that looked like. You can you'll get hints of, you know, blaming people for their problems. You'll get hints of like white savior, you know, you'll get kind of hints of those little things in how people answer questions like that. But yeah, it would be great if there was like a kind of like a one question.
Yeah, we have done it, you know, the System of Care grant, we had to ask those things, but I'm starting to realize that the questions probably were too general, you know, like they need to be more targeted to get more information.
Yeah, that's a great direction to send it in. Yeah, I wish I had a one question. That's a really good idea. All right, well, I'll go on and move us on. There's just a couple more slides here. Hopefully, you know, thinking a little more action oriented. First, wanted to acknowledge the limits of this research. You know, there's different, the evidence will show different things, whether someone's describing their own cultural competence versus whether they're responding to vignettes or being observed. And so for, you know, areas where there's only one or two studies, it's just important to acknowledge that. And these mixed results at the higher levels of development. So the idea isn't that, you know, there's something shameful about being at earlier stages of development, or, you know, we should rush people through things, you know, right? We should be trying to build a society that isn't based on these norms. And so, you know, people don't have so much to unlearn. It's not that you should, you know, be embarrassed if your kids, you know, go through immersion in college. You should be happy for them that they made it there. And again, those kind of mixed results at the higher levels of development. There are lines of thinking out there that really, if you can get to that pseudo independence place, that anything beyond that might, you know, is almost kind of getting into like, you know, someone's personal, I don't know if personal choices is the right word, but sort of like, you know, where they would need to be. And so, you know, making sure that folks get to that pseudo independence piece is important, but beyond that, it might, you know, some might say it's unreasonable to expect all white people to develop to that point. All right, so I wanted to give a couple action steps. First, thinking about administration. A lot of us on this call are in administration, so I was trying to kind of think about how it might apply. First one, just bringing awareness into the conversation and really identifying colorblind attitudes. And you know, you guys, everyone in this training, you know, you guys came, you were interested in a topic like this. And it's really just things like that, right? That exposure. When folks are feeling hostile, that's when they really don't want to engage with information or reality. And so, you know, providing those training opportunities. If you're in a role where you select training topics, you know, I think it definitely deserves consideration. Also consider the implications for all training topics, right? So if you're if you you know, want to have a series on equity and you want to have these different trainings, it's a good lens to apply to say, it's not necessarily like, oh, is this training too advanced, but more like, will this audience be able to absorb this material, or does the development matter, right? Should people be kind of in different stages? Should there be beginner, intermediate, you know, things like that. Also, administratively, you know, create the pathways of accountability, right? Pseudo independence would have you think that, yeah, I get it, and now I'm, you know how to solve it. I'm gonna, you know, these are the things I'm gonna do for communities of color. That's pseudo independence. That's not autonomy. And so, really creating those pathways of true accountability, which does mean giving up power. You know, setting up frameworks where communities of color can hold their behavioral health services accountable. That is, you know, something that's not really done that much, I would say, and could be done more. And then I always recommend adopting what they call a choice points framework. I have a slide on that. It's just a very easy way to kind of integrate this into your day-to-day actions in administration. Really, the concept behind it is that when you're in essentially like a racist system, really small choices essentially accumulate and retain the status quo. So the big decisions do really matter, and, you know, being bold and, you know, trying to make big change, that it's important, but a lot of the accumulation and that, you know, just the absolute wall of the status quo, the idea is that a lot of that's actually maintained by very small choices. And so essentially that's the intervention. It's really a non-intervention. The idea is that if you can become conscious of choice points, you can help decrease your implicit bias. So essentially, when you're making decisions, you're really asking yourself, what would happen if I didn't use an equity lens, right? So what, you know, what could some unintended consequences be? And essentially just asking yourself that question and thinking it through before you make the decision. And so just kind of by labeling it a choice point in your head, you're just running through. It doesn't mean that every single, you know, you're going to find something salient in every single decision, but, you know, in a system like a government system, you know, you probably will find a lot of salience in these really small decisions that you're making. So it's really just a way to increase your awareness. And then these are some, preconditions. So if you're going to ask yourself, like, what do you think? You do need some other things surrounding you. So number one, you need to be part of a diverse team. So you don't want to be just only with people that are similar to you and are going to see things the same way as you. You want those different viewpoints. You want to include all voices in the planning process. Again, if you don't have if you're kind of making decisions in a silo and limiting the input of the community or people that you work with, you won't even really recognize the choice points. Obviously, you want to be willing to check your own bias. You want to be willing to have hard conversations with others. And then also you can look for tools, right? There's a lot of people trying to do work in this area, putting out, tools and questionnaires and things like that to really, again, very imperfectly move through this process of making these changes. So next, these are some action steps more for awareness and personal development. So, one, the basic one that we've kind of been talking about is cultivate your own awareness, right? Identify the stages and behaviors. If you feel sort of those passions at times, but then if you end up kind of moving back into more of pseudo-independence or even experiencing any of that internal hostility towards communities of color after hearing certain news stories or whatever it is, you should be able to identify that very quickly, right? And identifying setbacks as well as growth opportunities. And so this is just like a quote that if you haven't read Beverly Tatum's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together, it's a great book, and she wrote an updated version of it. This is just a quote for her specific to white identity, that really the task is you're looking for a positive identity that again is based in reality. There's scientific evidence, there's definitive evidence that this racism, permeates our society. And so really basing your identity in that reality and not in assumed superiority. And you have to acknowledge that it is significant, right? It's socially significant, it's personally significant, and, learning to find a way to feel good about it, to feel empowered about it. And again, not in the sense of white pride, but really just in that commitment to a just society. Essentially the same way that, probably for 20 years, this has been emphasized for communities of color, again, with people in power, usually trying to change more about what's going on in communities of color. This idea of building that strong racial identity has been out there for communities of color, but, I think a little bit less so when it comes to the importance of developing an anti-racist white identity. Just a few more personal awareness things to consider. So again, already talked about reality a lot, and really identifying those cognitive dissonant experiences when you're trying to hold two pieces of information in your mind at once and they conflict with each other. Really try to notice that, like, I really think that I'm qualified for that. I really think that I got this promotion based on my own merit. But, looking at the questions they asked in the hiring committee, there's probably more qualified candidates of color for that job. Actually holding, conflicting information in your head at once and trying to, again, be empowered to make changes and try to impact what's really going on. Also seek out information, right? And practice being comfortable with that discomfort. If you experience these feelings that you're able to identify as part of a stage of development, and try to get comfortable with them. Practice not projecting that onto people of color, right? And also, if you're into mindfulness at all, or if you practice loving kindness, the idea is that this is also something that that white people need to hold themselves accountable for, right? It's not, you know, immersion when you know, there might be this high criticism of yourself and other white people also. You know, it's not that's the goal. The idea is that you can be firm in your understanding of where folks need to develop to, but still love them, and still show support for them, and help them through their change, and, you know, help them see where they are, and you know, but also be firm about it. You might want to include it in your case conceptualizations if you're still doing any type of practicing. It can be important to consider with other developmental considerations. And also, you know, take the time to think about your broader relations to power and control. You know, again, going back to the beginning, this is a social construct that's, you know, based on tying physical features and skin color to notions of superiority and inferiority as a way to gain power and take power. So think about your broader relationships with power, especially if you are white. You know, not just racism, but power more generally, and how you share power with the people around you, and how you feel when you know, maybe you have a lack of control, or, you know, things like that. So really kind of just learning yourself better when it comes to power and control more generally. And then, of course, you know, we know that with autonomy, when we're going to live in reality, the action steps do include rejecting certain notions and resisting the status quo, right? So to find ways to be an accountable ally, and to be an accomplice to people of color, take responsibility for your own development. Probably the most important, I would say, is paying it forward. Reject when people cultivate a colorblind attitude in children. Actively reject that, and provide opportunities for your children and the children that you know, to move through the phases and to reject that colorblind attitude. Because cultivate, you know, that essentially that attitude was cultivated for multiple generations, and, you know, we're kind of seeing that now in terms of where people kind of are with their development. So really thinking about kids, knowing that in the contact phase they are absorbing reality, and so whether that's just in the form of implicit bias and stereotyping, or whether it's through you know, something that ultimately is able to become conscious, you know, that's going to be the difference we can pay forward to the next generation. Be part of a coalition, right? Look for coalitions that are led by people of color. Look for work that does take that power analysis to racism, because that is so important for behavioral health. And, you know, be part of the work, and do what you can to work to change racist institutions. All right, so wanted to end with everyone taking a moment to think about some goals. If you have any ideas that you would want to share, or that you think might be a good idea, and want to share it more so that other people might think about it too, would love that. But also don't feel that you know, have to like share your goals verbally if they're personal. But in terms of thinking about it, I want you to think about 3 things. One, how can you use this knowledge in your work? So externally, so outside of yourself, how can you use this in what you do in the community or in administration? Also, set one goal for your personal development, right? How can you, you know, how can you, you know, learn more about your identity, you know, be more firmly committed to these goals and things like that. And then along those lines, set one goal regarding your commitment. And if you're not there and your goal is more about, you know, still finding ways to notice and reject that internal hostility, and sort of that pseudo independence with sort of that white savior piece of, yeah, this is real, but you know, we're gonna get folks back on track. You know, if that's still what you're noticing, notice that. You know, that is, you know, a lot of people are there, and so your goal would be to, you know, to process those thoughts and feelings. And then, but if you are experiencing, if you feel like you might be more autonomous, or maybe trying to shift from a more immersive experience into autonomy, set a goal about, how are you going to reject racism? How are you going to protest it? How are you going to resist it? And making sure that you have that commitment. Because again, if you don't have that commitment, it's not in your actions, you're probably either in pseudo independence, so kind of not really understanding it but not really feeling it, or immersion where you're feeling it very strongly but you're very uncomfortable and kind of caught up and don't feel that you have any control over making those types of changes. So try to set a goal there. So that is all. We're not going to do that. That is all I have. So I'll pause there. Anyone have anything that they would like to share or build upon before we wrap up? All right. Well, take another minute to, if you didn't take the first opportunity, or if you were multitasking, take another minute to really set those goals and set those intentions, if possible, in those 3 areas, so that you can kind of achieve them in the coming weeks. So we can go on and Glencora, should we end it there? 2:25.
I will stop the recording now, especially if there's somebody who feels like they want to say something but not be recorded.